What is up, Westlake? We are back again with Unit 2 review for APUSH. Let's just get right into it. It's 7 pages long. This is going to be really terrible and it's going to suck. But before we get into all the sucky stuff, I have four very exciting announcements. First, yes, I know what you're all thinking. This is the Lego Notre Dame de Paris that I finished today. Super exciting. Number 2, perhaps the most exciting. If you look in the description of this video, there is a full, handcrafted, 28-question practice test that you can use. It's all over Unit 2, and because the test isn't like a vocabulary quiz, right? It's like this weird AP stuff where it's like, because of this, causes this, blah, blah, blah. And if you're ever like, I feel like I know the terms, but I need practice on the questions, just go in the description. 28 questions. It has a key at the bottom, and hopefully that will be useful for you guys. Third announcement. Another thing that's in the description is I recently started a history Substack, and I just like send out a newsletter once a week. And if you want that, it's also free. It's also in the description. And fourthly, all of this stuff would not be possible without the help of my two friends, Connor Kramer, who helped me digest all of this stuff because there's like 100 and whatever terms on here, and he helped look through the textbook and get a bunch of these definitions, so I thank him a lot for that. And Jake Strelitz, who is editing this video because I cannot edit Jack DeBilly squat. So thank you very much for their help, and let's start with all of this trash. Alright, let's do this. Chapter 2, starting with the Roanoke Colony. My aunt was born in Roanoke, but you probably don't need to know that for the test. What you do need to know was that the Roanoke Colony was like the first permanent colony in the Western Hemisphere from the English, and everyone who lived there just randomly disappeared. People think they went to go live with the natives, but who really knows? Next we have the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada was the strongest navy up until 1588 when the British decisively defeated them in battle, and once they did that, they were able to like secure their naval route to the New World. They didn't have to worry about Spanish Navy harassing them on their way over. So that was huge because they were able to freely transport resources, people, etc. And that kind of just made it a lot easier, the migration process. The enclosure movement and surplus population. Okay. The enclosure movement's a little bit complicated, but basically the King of England was like, I'm gonna make a tax on how much land you own because I'm broke, and nobody really knew how much land they owned, so everyone was required to put up these fences and walls to like show how much land they owned, so that when the tax collectors came around, they knew how much tax everybody owed. The issue was that a lot of like the shepherds and other rural populace, they like would wander from territory to territory, especially for like the sheep and stuff, to munch on the grass, and they couldn't do that once the enclosure movement started. So they all moved to big urban cities, and then everyone was poor there for the most part, and there were so many people, and it was crowded, and it was kind of sucky, and a lot of the people were like, I don't want to do this, let's go to the New World and make a new life for myself. But there was also this other, so a lot of the people who went to the New World were poor people, normally turned out to be indentured servants, who were trying to go make a new life for themselves. The other group of people were the super wealthy. If you were like a second or third son, you couldn't receive the inheritance, so you see a lot of offspring that aren't the first son. They will go to America with some money to make a life for themselves because they can't inherit what their dad has. So that's pretty cool. So you have like this big class divide, upper class, lower class. If there's indentured servitude on one more of these learning targets, I'm gonna punch something. We know what an indentured servant is. I'm not gonna explain it to you. Goals of English settlers. Most of the English settlers went there to, as I said before, create a new life for themselves. Others to make a lot of money. Trying to go quick, so this isn't a 90-hour video. Cultural changes. Okay, talking about the ways the native culture changed with the introduction of the Europeans. Obviously, the stuff from Unit 1, like the introduction of the horse, led them to be able to hunt bison, but also the introduction of other things like alcohol and guns basically destroys native culture, and it just kind of wipes it off the face of the earth as these like exotic European goods come in and basically transform the way natives live, and it kind of sadly destroys their culture for the most part. Demographic changes. The English, unlike the French, who just sent a bunch of horny, like, single dudes and made a bunch of babies with natives, the English did not do that. They sent married couples or people who were going to marry other white English settlers, and they didn't really intermingle with the native population the same way the French did or the Spanish, and they didn't like have these like ethnically diverse offspring. They were just there. They were white people and they were natives, and they traded, and they didn't really do anything else other than that. Economic changes. The English would trade with the natives. Obviously, they'd give them like whatever they could: guns, alcohol, blankets, anything, iron axes. Like they would trade with them, and they would often seize their land after military conquest and whatnot. So that was pretty cool. Am I missing anything? Yeah, so basically after the indentured servants finished their allotted time, the English would just go take territory from natives to give it to the indentured servants. And sometimes they would give them like a token price, like here's like some fish hooks for your land. Pretty famously, I think they bought the island of New York for like $20 worth of pots and blankets, something stupid like that. Anyway, Chesapeake Bay location. Okay, so what you have to know is that it's the divide between Virginia and Maryland, and it's like this swampy, marshy area where there's a bunch of disease and it's hard to grow crops, and it kind of sucks. But there's tobacco there, so you can make a bunch of money doing that. And Jamestown was the first settlement there on the Chesapeake Bay, and Jamestown's first leader was a guy named John Smith. John Smith was like this militaristic leader. He kind of turned Jamestown into a military boot camp, like a fort, a militia, which kept them alive in this hostile land where they kind of had to fend for themselves against the natives. But after this big gunpowder incident, the British were like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, so they brought him back to England. I mean, he wasn't that bad, but whatever. Anyway, the Virginia Company of London. These were the investors behind the settlement in Jamestown, so they were funding it. They were the ones who decided who was in charge. They were the ones who decided what they were going to try to achieve there, like what the focus is. So that was that. Joint stock companies. This is another WAP term. If you took that, it's just a group of investors come together. They share the risk, they share the reward. This kind of opens a new lane for expeditions to different parts of the world, because previously it was only big governments that would fund the expedition, and they would either take all the reward for themselves or take all the loss themselves. But now you see this group of wealthy, like this group of upper class people coming together to like make these companies, which is like the start of capitalism and blah 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 blah. Not too important. Anyway, the goals of Jamestown Colony, they were originally there to find gold, and then they got there and there was no gold, and they're like, oh man. But then there was tobacco, and then as the Virginia Company of London was like, okay, we're gonna not search for gold anymore, and we're just gonna build a bunch of tobacco. But it turns out, in order to grow tobacco, you need people to plant it and harvest it. So they get the headright system, and they say any colonist who pays for their voyage to the Americas will give you 50 acres of land, and you can harvest tobacco for us. Blah 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 blah. And this like drastically increased the number of colonists. And that's what happened. Headright system gives you land, increases colonization. Virginia House of Burgesses, blah 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 blah. It was just the first like form of governance in the Americas. It was like this colonial assembly, and it was democratic, but the only people who could vote was this select group of landowning men. So it was just like the first form of governance. And there's also like a governor who could veto anything. So I don't know. Powhatan. He was the chief he was like the chief of the tribe that was next to Jamestown, and he realized the advantage of trading with the settlers, and they relied on him for food. So he was like, wait, I actually kind of like, I'm the one who gives them their food, so they rely on me. And eventually he captured John Smith and threatened to kill him, but his daughter saved us. This is where the story of Pocahontas comes from, if you were wondering. And after Powhatan died, his brother led a surprise attack and killed 300 colonists, and everyone was like, no. So yeah, that was the thing. Goals of Maryland Colony. Okay, so originally Maryland was created as a refugee for Catholics trying to flee from persecution. And it was kind of set up in a feudalist manner, similar to patroonship. If you remember that from the last unit, it was set up in a feudalist manner where like these manors would have essentially serfs or slaves working for them, and then they would give some of their money to the crown, and that was that. So it was just mainly a refuge where Catholics and some Puritans could find safety from the religious turmoil taking place in England. All right, Puritanism. Let's scroll down here. All right. So the Puritans were like these Protestants who weren't really a part of the Protestant Reformation. They didn't agree with the Church of England or with the Catholics, and they followed the ideas of this guy John Calvin, who's, if you're really into religion, you might know him. He's single election, double election, predestination, some interesting stuff. The Puritans were interested in creating this perfect city, the city set upon a hill. They believed that you could gain, or that you could not gain salvation, but you could lose it. Biblical, but that was what they thought. They were basically just like this cult of Protestants who weren't necessarily Protestants anyway. Separatists, they were people who aligned themselves with like smaller separate groups. So for example, the Pilgrims were separate from the Puritans, but they could still kind of align themselves with them. That's a stupid term. You don't need to know it. Except you might, but probably not. If they ask you about the separatists on the test, just be like, what the heck? But yeah, they're like just like smaller groups of people. John Winthrop, he was the governor of Massachusetts, and he was a Puritan. That's about the only information that you need to know. All right, Pilgrims. Okay, so they were separatists. The Pilgrims were a separatist group of Puritans who fled from the Netherlands because they believed that Satan was affecting England. People were weird back then. And then they fled to the Americas on the Mayflower, and they established like their little colony at the side of Plymouth. You can still go and see the Plymouth Rock today if you want. I hear it's very underwhelming, but it's there, and you can see it. They were like trying to like make a base settlement where they could make profit and blah blah blah. Anyway, Mayflower Compact. This was a group. This was like the first written frame of government. It was a thing decided upon by all the different people on the Mayflower before they landed. They agreed this is what we're going to do, just and equal laws from representatives of their choosing. So they kind of just set up their own little form of governance. The Great Puritan Migration. Okay. So the Massachusetts Bay Company was founded to further the Puritan cause and make money by trading with Indians. About 21,000 Puritans immigrated to Massachusetts, and this like boosted the New England colony's population a lot, because this kind of evened out the male to female ratio. Originally, it was just a lot of males, and then with the Great Puritan Migration, a lot of females came, so they were able to kind of replace their population. The Puritan family structure, they just believed that males held the authority within the household, pretty basic stuff. I severely limited women's rights in marriage. Women were allowed to become full members of the church, and divorce was legal, but the male's authority in the house was absolute. There was no questioning that. Outside of being able to go to church, as a woman, you can't really do much. Oh, and get a divorce, but yeah, that's about it. Okay. Franchise voting rights in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, provincial towns versus governments. So basically, in Massachusetts Bay, they were just self-governing towns with their own congressional church, and they enacted a general court with delegates that were elected by these landowning church members. A while later, company officials and elected deputies were separated into two legislative houses. If there's a question about franchise voting rights in the Massachusetts Bay Colony on the test, just guess. Don't worry about it. Realistically, this is just a stupid thing. All right, election of governor and assistants. Every local official, delegate, and general court. Every local official, delegate of the general court, and the colonial governor was elected by free men. The governor was elected by the freemen of Massachusetts and was the top ruler of the colony. It was just elected by people who could vote, which was basically no one unless you owned land and you were white and you were a man. The freemen, or visible saints, what the Puritans called them, were full members of the Puritan Church who demonstrated that they experienced divine grace and were the only citizens permitted to vote. So if you weren't a visible saint, you can't vote. So unless God's divine grace comes upon you and you experience it, you can't vote. Roger Williams, Rhode Island. Okay. So Roger Williams was just this young guy who arrived in Massachusetts and argued that all law-abiding citizens should have the right to vote. And the Puritans were like, no, only divinely touched people can vote. And he was like, they're like, get out of our city, you're a weirdo, or get out of our colony, you're a weirdo. And so he went to Rhode Island and set up his own little gig. And in Rhode Island, anyone can practice any religion. And so he kind of just like created a little safe haven for everyone. So that's kind of cool. Next we have the establishment of the Baptist Church. Roger Williams first established the Baptist Church in Rhode Island shortly after his banishment. That happened. Pretty cool. Reverend Thomas Hooker, this dude is from Connecticut. And he was a minister who had religious disputes with the colony of Massachusetts because the Puritans were difficult people. And they formed a settlement in Hartford in 1636. All you need to know is he didn't agree with the Puritans and he made his own colony. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. A system of government for Connecticut based off of Massachusetts, kind of with an emphasis on the exception that men did not have to become members of the church to vote. So, as long as you were a white man who owned property, you could vote. You didn't have to be divinely inspired by God in order to vote. You just had to own property and be white and a man. So, pretty lax on the voting rules over there. Next we have Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Where are we? Okay. It was just a system of government in Connecticut based off of Massachusetts. Oh, wait, did I say this? Yeah, that was what I was saying. Okay, dissenters. Okay, dissenters were this group of Protestants who belonged to other denominations than the established church, like Baptists or whatever. Like, if you didn't align exactly with the Protestant movement, then you were considered a dissenter. Puritan treatment of Quakers. So the Puritans persecuted the Quakers hardcore. They were like, you're like a heretic, and they would sometimes like mutilate you, and sometimes they would kill you, and sometimes they would just fine you, and sometimes they would throw you in prison. They didn't like the Quakers. Anne Hutchinson was a woman who traveled all over and led discussions where she insulted the ministers of the Puritan church, and then she got banished because you can't do that. And in 1637, she was put on trial for expressing opinions that were dangerous to the authorities. She lost the trial and got banished and died a few years after, so pretty cool. Or not cool. Don't do that. The Picot War. The Picot War was triggered by competition over the fur trade and expanding the English settlements. There was this big mystic massacre where Englishmen and I can't pronounce that, and native forces killed over 500 Picot in their fortified village, and then the war ended with the near extermination of the Picot people. So English fought natives, English killed a lot of natives, and the Europeans expanded their territory once again. Rinse and repeat, baby. King Philip's War. Oh my goodness, it's another war against natives where they kick their butt and take their land, and yeah, that happened. They were fighting over expanding their territory so they could give more land to indentured servants and other people. And after they destroyed the what were they? I don't know what the group of people were called, but once they destroyed them, they like completely annihilated them, and all native resistance in the area just broke. So the English were just free to do whatever they wanted. All right, Body of Liberties. How much longer do we? Oh, we're almost done. Okay, Body of Liberties. We're almost done with chapter 2. We're almost halfway done with the video or something like that. This is going to be rough, and I have a hunch that these learning targets are only going to get longer. All right, Body of Liberties. So they were just Puritans from East Anglia, this place in Britain. They sought religious freedom and economic opportunity. They focused on family farms that produced food, small surplus, so like subsistence farming, not trying to make these cash crops to sell for profit. And they also did like fishing and timber was their main export. Unlike the Chesapeake colonies, up in New England they had few slaves because they didn't need these massive manual labor-based plantation and agriculture. They provided some rights, and they were a little bit better than the South, but it was the 17th century. What can you expect? All right. The halfway covenant. Okay, body of liberty is just right. Like, it was more lax up there, and they sold timber. The halfway covenant. Okay, so the New England Puritans introduced this thing called the halfway covenant in 1662. This allowed the baptism and like partial church membership of descendants of early settlers based on their ancestry rather than religious conversion. So it was like if you were related to that guy, you could join the church rather than if you actually converted to the religion. This compromise aimed to like address the problem of like stagnating church membership. People weren't really joining the church. They were having a hard time finding members. It didn't fully resolve the issue, and ministers criticized the growing moral and spiritual decline of the Puritans. All right, concept of English liberty. This is just basically what does it mean to be the rights of an Englishman? Because in England, people have certain rights, and they were told that if they come to America, they'll have certain rights. And there's this tension where like sometimes they weren't treated like English citizens, and this was one of the things that also led to the American Revolution. So just something to keep in the back of your mind, that the people who lived in America were entitled to rights as an Englishman, whether or not they got them all the time. Why is the Puritan treatment of Quakers on here again? Am I like losing my mind? Puritan treatment of Quakers. Puritan treatment of Quakers. I guess this is very important, so I will restate that the Puritans treated the Quakers like heretics, and they would kill you or fine you or mutilate you or throw you in prison or do whatever they could to get you out of their territory because they didn't like the Quakers. Apparently you got to know that. The Maryland Toleration Act. Okay, originally Maryland was the safe haven for the Catholics, but as time went on, Protestants began to outnumber the Catholics in Maryland, and this tension grew. And so the Maryland Toleration Act was this thing where everyone was allowed to practice whatever religion they want, as long as it was Trinitarian and not Puritan, I think. So basically, they were like, if you're Protestant or Catholic, you can express your religion however you want. But those were basically the only allowed religions. If you were not Christian, that was not cool. If you were not Trinitarian, that was not cool. So, yeah. That's chapter 2, my friends. All right, chapter 3, which, thank the Holy Lord and Savior, is significantly shorter than chapter 2. Mercantilism, another WAP term that makes a reappearance. It was just an economic policy aimed at maximizing the profit that comes from the colonies. Basically, the mother colony or the motherland should be making a bunch of money off the colonies, maximize exports, minimize imports, build a massive national wealth. Number 2, Navigation Acts. These were a series of laws passed by England. They were to regulate colonial trade and ensure that it benefited England. So if there was any trade going on that was not for the benefit of England, it would not be allowed. These acts required that goods shipped on English ships. These acts required that goods be shipped on English ships and pass through English ports. No freelance mercenarying. You have to use the English way. All right. The Charter of Liberties and Privilege. This was granted by the New York Assembly, and this charter aimed to establish like a framework of self-governance and affirm certain rights, and contributed to this big like political diversity thing. So all you have to know is that in Pennsylvania and New York, they're a little bit more progressive than some of the other places. They had more rights for people. In William Penn in Pennsylvania, this was like the Quaker safe haven because the Puritans hated them. And basically every other persecuted religious group, anyone was allowed. This was Penn's holy experiment, and he emphasized like a religious freedom and democratic principles and good relations with the Native Americans. So, pretty good guy by modern standards, William Penn. So think Pennsylvania, New York, more liberal, progressive, like inclusive, universal suffrage type stuff. More Enlightenment. Think Enlightenment. Quakers, they were dissed on by the Puritans whenever they got the chance, and they were a religious group known for their pacifism, meaning very peaceful, egalitarian beliefs, and opposed slavery. The settlement in Pennsylvania fostered like this religious diversity and attracted settlers from all over the place. So the Quakers were pretty lax, good people, but the Puritans hated them and called them heretics for liking people that weren't Christian. Anyway, origins of American slavery. Growth of slavery in Africa and the West Indies, British North America. Okay, the demand for labor on these big plantations for like tobacco and sugar led to the growth of African slavery because they actually killed the entire native populace with disease, and they need someone to work these fields, and there were not enough indentured servants, so they turned to slaves from Africa. The impact of the sugar and tobacco trade on slavery, I kind of just explained that, but they needed people to work, and these crops made the British and everyone else super rich, so they bought Africans from other Africans and brought them to the New World and made them work. So that was a thing that happened. Problems of indentured servitude and the shift to slavery. Okay. So Bacon's Rebellion. Let's go down. Bacon's Rebellion. This was a revolution, replaced James II with William and Mary, and strengthened parliamentary power, this British political thing. And it influenced American colonists by encouraging them to challenge royal authority. So the Bacon's Rebellion, getting ahead of myself, was kind of almost a precursor to the American Revolution, saying you can do it, you can rebel against the British royalty. Transition from a society with slaves to a slave society. This was just meaning that instead of the economy being centered around not slaves, basically slaves became pivotal for the economy. If you took slaves out of America, you weren't making any money. Previously, it had been that you could use indentured servants or natives, but now that they were all gone and that the only way you were making money was off of these cash crops like tobacco, you needed slaves to work the plantations. And if you didn't have them, you wouldn't make any money. So you needed the slaves. Social and political crises. All right, Glorious Revolution. This was just like this. Whoa. Oh no. Okay. So the thing that I just said, the Glorious Revolution, was the one in England. The Bacon's Rebellion was in Virginia. I apologize. The thing that I said earlier was the Glorious Revolution. I'm tripping. Okay. Let me go back to the Bacon's Rebellion. This was a rebellion of Virginia settlers led by this guy named Nathaniel Bacon, hence the Bacon Rebellion, which is a sick name, against the governor of Virginia. The uprising was highlighting tensions between wealthy landowners and poor indentured servants. And after this, the governor was like, I'll just get African slaves because they aren't annoying. So that was another reason why they switched from indentured servitude to African slaves. My apologies. The Glorious Revolution was the revolution in England that showed the Americans that they could fight back against the royalty. My apologies. The English Bill of Rights came out the same year as the Glorious Revolution. It limited the powers of the monarchy and laid the foundation for a constitutional monarchy, and it inspired the colonists to demand more rights and self-government. So, kind of like I said earlier, part of the Glorious Revolution, part of the reason why the colonists are starting to stand up to the royalty, part of the reason that the American Revolution happens in 1776, Lords of Trade and Dominion of New England. The Dominion consolidated several colonies under one governor. Basically, like the New England Patriots, like that area. So like Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, that's New England. It consolidated a bunch of different colonies into one governor, and basically the governor sucked. So that didn't last very long. Leisler's Rebellion. And this was a rebellion in New York led by this guy named Jacob Leisler, which is significantly less cool of a name than Nathaniel Bacon. He fought against a ruling elite driven by a broader context. He looked at the Glorious Revolution and was like, I want to do that. But it was also kind of focused on local grievances that they had with the wealthy landowners, and it happened. Poor people fighting against rich people, just like every other rebellion. English Toleration Act. This act granted freedom to worship to most Protestants, easing some religious tensions. Did it fix everything? No. Did it try to make things better? Yes. English Toleration Act, freedom of worship to most Protestants. Salem witch trials. Ooh boy. If you were in Honors English 1, I think we read The Crucible, and so you kind of know what happened, but if you weren't in Honors English 1, basically the Salem witch trials were, I was Puritans. I'd hardly read the book, I can't lie. But it was a series of hearings where they didn't really listen that much, and they just decided that some women that they came across were captivated by the devil, and they killed them. So that was the thing that happened. Yeah, it was in Massachusetts, so it was Puritans. It just kind of reflected that they were a little off the rails. Someone was just like, I think she's a witch, and they were like, yep, sounds good, and killed her. So that was the state of religious affairs in the late 17th century. Directions of social and economic change in the 18th century colonies. Okay. Settlement patterns and backcountry expansion. Okay. So people began moving westward in backcountry looking for land because the indentured servants, they worked there 7 years or whatever, and they were like, all right, time to get my land. And the English were like, we don't have any land, so we're just going to go take some from the natives over there. So they did that. Walking Purchase of 1737. So this was a controversial land deal between the Penn family and the Lenape that led to the displacement of Native Americans in Pennsylvania. Another case of being like, English people being like, I'm going to buy your land, and the natives are like, no, and they're like, too bad. Here's like $10 for the state of Pennsylvania, and it's like, all right. So that was the thing. Just shows more English expansion. Consumerism and transatlantic triangular trade. So if you don't know what the triangle trade is, it's Europe sends stuff to America, America sends stuff back to Europe, and Europe makes money, and then Europe goes to Africa, gets slaves, sends them to America, the slaves make money, send stuff back to Europe, and then it's like a triangle, you see? And consumerism was the growing demand for stuff in Europe. Everyone was like, I like all this stuff, I want more of the stuff, and in order to make more of the stuff, they need more people to build the stuff. So in order to get more people to build the stuff, they got people from Africa to build the stuff, but they needed a place to build all the stuff. So they brought them all to the New World, which was the place where they built all the stuff for really cheap, and then they brought it back to Europe where they got all the stuff. So all you need to know is that people wanted more stuff, so they had to build more stuff. All right. Difference in social classes in colonial America. In the New England and Middle colonies, they were like small farms, subsistence-based agriculture, mixed economies. It wasn't like the South where the only way to make money was off of cash crops. It was more of they're a very diverse economy. Some people did timber, some people did fishing, some people did agriculture, some people did mining, but there wasn't really anything other than coal that wasn't useful yet. Some staple crops for the New England was like wheat and grain, and like there wasn't the tobacco. Like in the middle colonies, in the South it was tobacco and rice and indigo, but in the North they just had like wheat, and it was boring. Labor source was mainly just family labor. Like you would have like 9 kids and they would all work in the farm. And indentured servants and some slaves, but they weren't critical to the economy. Like if you took out all the slaves, the economy would still function up in the North. Chesapeake and Southern colonies relied heavily on plantations. Tobacco, rice, indigo, which was a dye, make a bunch of money. And the labor source was family labor as well, indentured servitudes as well, but all slaves basically, like 90+% of all the workers were slaves. Without slaves, they couldn't build anything. It wouldn't work. The economy would fall apart. Slaves were necessary to harvest all this agriculture that made them so much money. Englishified. This was the process by which the colonists became more culturally similar to England, influencing social norms, taste, and governance. Like, they lived in England, they came to America, and they were like, let's bring England to America. So they were like making America like England. Because England's the bomb. Just kidding. Poverty in American colonies. Economic disparities grew with wealth concentrated in the hands of like a few elite landowners. Like there were like a couple of guys who came over with a bunch of money, and everyone else was poor. So I mean, it was like the conditions weren't great. Your only job was to build manufactured goods for cheap so you could sell them back to Europe at a discounted price. So I mean, that was what was happening. Most people were fairly poor and whatnot. But anyway, that's chapter 2. Or chapter 3. Now let's move on to chapter 4.
We have finally arrived to chapter 4. A lot of these subjects have kind of been touched on in WAP, and so if you take that, this chapter will be a little bit easier, but it's necessary nonetheless. Starting with the Atlantic slave trade, this is hopefully you guys all know about this. It was just the forced transportation of Africans from Africa, normally sold by other Africans, sadly, to the Europeans, and where they would take them across on a journey known as the Middle Passage. Whoa, that's convenient. And the Middle Passage was just this horrific, often 2 to 3 month voyage, where like 80 to 100 slaves would be put on one ship, and they would be transported across the Atlantic in these destitute conditions to get from Africa to the New World. It was just really poor conditions. Most of them died. I mean, sorry, not most of them. A lot of them died. Very, very high mortality rate. Sometimes you would see half of them gone by the time they get there. It wasn't always that bad, but it was not a fun journey by any means. All right, Chesapeake slavery. It was just slavery in the Chesapeake region, primarily Virginia and Maryland. It was mainly tobacco harvesting was the primary thing that they did there. It was chattel slavery, which basically means that the slaves were considered property and they had no legal rights. Indian slavery, this form of slavery was like Native Americans. They were enslaved. This was more taking place in the southern colonies, New England. It wasn't as widespread as African slavery. Whenever you hear slavery mentioned, it will probably be talking about Africans and not Native Americans. But they were enslaved on a smaller scale in the South. Slavery in the North, slavery in the northern colonies was, where are we? Oh yeah, there you go. Slavery in the northern colonies, it was still harsh. It was less central to the economy. In the South, they really relied on the plantation agriculture labor of like producing tobacco, and that's how their economy survived. In the North, it was not that. They were more subsistence-based agriculture, and the slaves were used for different things, and they weren't as necessary to the economy, which plays into the Civil War way down the road, which is why the South and the North split, because the South need the slaves for their economy to survive, whereas the North does not. So yeah, next, melding of Christianity with traditional African beliefs. Okay, it was just enslaved Africans would like combine their traditional beliefs with Christianity. Some of these forms, one of them that you might know is voodoo. Voodoo is a mix of African religion. I forget exactly if it's called like Vodun, and then they mixed it with Christianity, and you get this thing called voodoo, which is very popular in like Jamaica. So that the mixing of Christianity and African religions creates new things such as gula. Well, I guess this wasn't necessarily Christianity, but it was a unique African culture that developed amongst the enslaved people, primarily in the South. It blended African languages, customs, foodways, because they all came from different parts of Africa, and they would blend the different parts of African culture that they had together to make this thing called gula. All right, resistance to slavery, both overt and covert. This was just the slaves rebelled quite often. Normally they never won. The slave owners would always put down the insurrection, but they happened quite often. They would either like purposefully work slow to sabotage, or they would just openly rebel and like start killing people. But you need to know, the primary thing that you need to know is that they were rebelling and they did not like the conditions. But who would? It's slavery. One example of this is the Stono Rebellion, which was in the video that we learned about, and the video that we watched. It was a significant slave rebellion, and it was the biggest uprising, and it was these slaves trying to get from, where were they? I don't know, I think they were in South Carolina, and they were trying to get to St. Augustine to get their freedom. And on the way, they were burning all these plantations, and eventually they clashed with colonial militia, and they were unsuccessful. Most of them died. They were beheaded, or shot, blah, 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 and, but it shows that they were willing to risk their lives for freedom. And where are we next? Okay, I can describe the meaning of British liberty in the 18th century. Republicanism. Okay, republicanism has a lot of different forms throughout history. The way that it is in this context is like a political ideology centered around civic virtue and like the responsibility of the civic responsibility of a citizen. The common good, active participation in public affairs, kind of lesser on the centralized authority. So that is republicanism. Liberalism is more on the individual rights, thinking like universal suffrage. Everyone has innate rights that they are born with. This is like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. This is John Locke. He has like these beliefs that like humans are born with rights. And yeah, so that's the thing. And enfranchisement, it refers to the rights of the right to vote. People who get the right to vote. If you were enfranchised, that means that you were allowed to vote. In colonial America, it was basically just white men who owned property. As time progresses, this gets more universal. But in the colonial era, the only people who were enfranchised were white men who owned land. So that's something to know. Salutary neglect. Salutary neglect was a British policy that basically they just turned a blind eye to what was happening in the colonies. As long as they were producing profit, they didn't really care how it was done, and they didn't really enforce regulations on the colonies. And it was kind of like this mutual thing where it's like the colonies can be primarily independent as long as they were still being beneficial to the British crown. And this is really fostered like a sense of independence in the Americans, and that's one of the big factors that led to the American Revolution. But I mean, it's pretty cool. They got to basically govern themselves, so pretty nice. And then what's next? 18th century colonial assemblies. These were just like I think they were elected bodies, but there were these colonial groups that had like autonomy and power, and they were just like regional governments basically. And sometimes their power would like rival royal governors, but it was just kind of a beginning of autonomous government apart from the crown in the colonies. Public sphere, this is a place where people, it was like a coffee shop or a public forum. It was where you'd go and hang out and you'd like exchange ideas and talk to other people. It was like a common space where you would just kind of hang out. Whenever newspapers started happening, this is where you'd go to like get the newspaper and you'd read it and you'd talk to other people about it. Blah, 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 blah. Speaking of newspapers, it's the freedom of the press in colonial America. John Peter Zenger trial. This 1735 trial was a New York printer. He criticized the the colonial governor, and the colonial governor obviously didn't like that. And then they took him to trial, and the printer won, which kind of established the free press, where you could criticize the government and you wouldn't get killed for it, which didn't happen for most of history. For most of history, the press was owned by the government. So this is kind of a new revelation in the world. Enlightenment. If you took WAP, you should know what this is. It was just like a new philosophical movement that emphasized like reason and truth and the innate human value. The context that you need to know this in is that the Americans loved the Enlightenment. They were super affected by it, which is why when the revolution happens in 1776, there are three: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are all Enlightenment ideals. And they are super affected by the Enlightenment, and that is what our Constitution is based off of. So really, it influenced America heavily. All right, Great Awakening. Hurrah. Let's come down here. Okay, the Great Awakening was like this religious revival movement, 1730s, 1740s, and it emphasized like this emotional, like religious experience, like personal piety, like you talking with God. It was like not between an institution that, like a Roman Catholic Church that had been around forever. It was like it was you and it was God, and that was the connection. You didn't talk to a priest who then talked to God or any of that. It was kind of like a mini Reformation, but in the Americas. So pretty cool. Jonathan Edwards was a key figure in the Great Awakening. He'd go around preaching, and the most famous thing that you need to know is sinners in the hands of angry gods. Both Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, the main thing that you just need to know is they were very influential preachers who were responsible for the Great Awakening and the way that changed the dynamic between Britain and America, because America began having separate religious values than Britain, which, although not a primary reason, was another reason that the American Revolution happened. Because you had this Roman Catholic Church-esque Anglican church in England, and then you had this super Protestant-esque church in colonial America, and they started clashing, but that's not super important. George Whitefield was just a super charismatic preacher who'd go around and draw large crowds spreading the Great Awakening message. Alright, the most exciting thing to end on. You made it. Congratulations. The geographic area of the Spanish Empire. Woohoo. It was just everything that wasn't the English or the French colonies, basically, or the Portuguese. It was a lot of South America, all of Mexico, most of Central America, Florida, New Mexico, California. They had the biggest swath of land that they started with. Father Junipero Serra, I'm very sorry for butchering your name. He was a Spanish missionary, and he was the first person to go to California and preach the gospel. He played a key role in the Spanish colonization of California. He kind of helped convert the populace and ushered in the Spanish colonists, and he's the reason why they colonized California, so that's cool. And then finally, we're done. The geographic area of French Empire. This is just Canada, parts of Canada called New France, the Great Lakes region, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, like Louisiana. And they had Haiti at this time, I'm pretty sure, as well. Once again, mainly focused on economics and fur trading and beaver pelts and all the good money-making stuff. And we did it. Hooray. Voila, you now know everything that you need to know for the Unit 2 test. I would definitely recommend doing the discussion questions, and I would also recommend doing the practice test that is in the description. And we made it. Good job, Westlake. Hope you guys do great on this test. See you later.